1 second. It says recording pending. Oh, okay, 1 second. Yeah, and now it started recording. Okay, hello everyone. So today I have a very interesting topic and some excellent guests to help discuss it. And the topic is science and religion, or science versus religion, however you like to view the relationship. So, and I would like to start with my guests. So I consider my guests very good friends, and I have actually interviewed them both for the podcast before. They're Jared Anderson and John Prince. And can you please each give a brief introduction of yourself? Either one can go first.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. So as a brief introduction, so I was raised a Latter-day Saint. I grew up in Texas. I eventually became a professor of biochemistry, and so I went through the whole academic route, getting a PhD in molecular biology, and it was really with sort of a bioinformatics focus. And so I had training as a data scientist and in systems biology, but eventually I ended up as a biochemistry professor doing computational biology and these types of things. I left BYU in 2014, and just shortly after experienced a faith transition. And so since then, I've been working as a software engineer and platform engineer and data scientist in different spaces and with different companies. I live in Provo, Utah, and I have some interest in philosophy and the philosophy of science and things like this. I'm sort of an amateur in that regard. So I would say, I was a academic scientist, but as a philosopher, I'm interested in these topics. But a true philosopher can probably run circles around me with these things. But I think what I have to offer is just sort of that raw practical experience with the actual investigation of difficult scientific topics and how that plays out in the real world. So.
Thanks. Jared?
So as you said, Jared Anderson, my passion is the intersection of human nature, spirituality, and religion. Very interested in how we work, why we work. So I was also raised Latter-day Saint. I like to both fulfill and transcend categories. I really like subversion, so still a member technically. And I have different modalities where I serve. So I also went the academic route, undergraduate in Middle Eastern Studies, Hebrew, went into biblical studies under Bart Ehrman at UNC Chapel Hill and Duke. Amazing experience. I felt very badly about myself for not writing my PhD dissertation for a couple of years. And then I started teaching world religions. So I taught courses on the Bible. My main training is textual criticism, historical criticism, biblical criticism. So how we read texts, how we understand the past, which is different than history. And then teaching world religions is what shattered me in a beautiful way and opened me up. We can come, like I've already talked about that in my episode. And so teaching world religions gave me that big picture, and I was more interested in like the human experience of religion. That's what led me to nonprofit work. And after a second divorce, that's when I became a chaplain. So I've been a chaplain for the past 5 years, endorsed by the Humanist Society. I'm an ordained Buddhist minister, and I just applied to be ordained as a New Thought Unity minister. So again, I consider all worldviews and religions like operating systems for our consciousness. And yet, personally, I am deeply mystical, emotional. Like I take very, very seriously that like aesthetic experience. Like a summary of my ministry is that I assess human need with social science and systems theory and address it with relationship and art. So I really like that interplay of like the human element and understanding things in a more scientific way.
Thank you very much. So just to add to the introduction, so I wanted to talk about the topic of science and religion, because science has had a very big impact on my religious belief and practice, and especially how it has evolved and transitioned in the last couple of years. So I have heard, many people say that they can perfectly harmonize science with their religious belief. And in my estimation, that is possible to an extent if you approach your religion's holy books with a considerably low level of literalism. And on the other hand, there are also those who say that they see absolutely no way to reconcile science with any religion, and therefore see no positive value in religion. And sometimes they're referred to as militant atheists. Or conversely, that science, that they see no value in science as it pertains to religion. So these are often, we refer to them as fundamentalist believers. So, opposed to those previous type, this latter type, I think they take a very highly literal perspective to scriptures and holy books. And of course, there's a continuum of degrees of reconciliation of science and religion between the two opposites. So I intend to discuss various science-informed approaches to religion with my guests. But before we consider those various approaches, I think it's valuable to spend some time to lay a foundation for our discussion by going over some basic topics concerning science and how it influences modern views on religion. So for starters, we will discuss topics like what we can know about reality, and what is science, and what are natural sciences, and what are social sciences. And then importantly, what is the scientific method and how it is used in natural and social sciences. And also, how is religion studied using methods of science? And so after we'll have laid this foundation, we will discuss the implications of modern science on religion. And I hope that you will find this discussion enlightening. And also, I hope that as a result, those who listen will be able to understand and find more compassion towards those whose views on religion differ from their own. So this is a little introduction to the topic. So before we go into what is science and natural sciences, which I would like maybe John to talk a little bit about. Jared, would you mind starting with this topic of like what can people know about reality, and like what how people view reality and what they think they can know about it?
Yeah, I think social science is really the bridge between this science and religion juxtaposition, because the irony of discussing science and religion is that we are humans discussing science and religion. And so the way humans think and the way humans debate is always at play. So just two quick comments that really impacted my journey. I remember reading an article by Richard Bushman called The Social Dimensions of Rationality. And I thought it was brilliant, because really it was a sociological relational analysis of academia, which in normal terms is like that even academics want others to like them and be impressed by them. And so that, like, we are all humans engaging in whatever endeavor we're engaging in. And I find it a delicious irony that even the, let's use constructive terms, even those who are devoted to science have an emotional relationship to their devotion to science. And so very often So the basis of everything is what are human needs. And I really enjoy evolutionary psychology and sociology, and behavioral economics and systems theory are two of my main lenses. So basically, this is this idea that everything we do is for a coherent reason. It can be a very dysfunctional, unhealthy reason, but it's coherent. And that's like therapists and social scientists. Like even if you are manifesting very unhelpful behaviors, pro-social is a technical term for engaging in behavior that is like good for you and good for the group. So even if we are doing things that aren't in our best interest, there are these clear reasons why we aren't doing things in our best interest. So as I understand it, the fundamental human need is security and stability, but like an interesting security and stability. So that's the survival instinct. So in groups, we want to have a clear sense of how the world works. And this is where history of interpretation comes in. And that is what we are actually loyal to. One of the most profound insights I've had from ministry is that we as human beings are more loyal to our stories about reality than actual reality, whatever that means. And so one of my favorite summaries is perception is hallucination and memory is fiction. And that's a provocative and playful way of commenting that from a scientific perspective, our brains take in some data and literally make up a hallucination adequate for survival. And that's another sobering thing, is that we are wired for survival, not thriving. And so basically, and then the other insight was from Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist of morality, religion, and politics. So he's very busy these days. He wrote The Righteous Mind, and he made the interesting insight. Another thing that we need to remember is that the way things actually function and the stories we tell about how they function are often opposite. And so we'll dig more into that. So for example, a good example of this is the academic debate, right? So the story we tell about an academic debate is that an academic debate is a performance to convince the audience, right? Like that's like whoever makes the best argument wins. But how it actually functions is that the debaters are each performing for their own team. And from a psychological and sociological...
John, sorry, John,
Yeah.
do you mind turning your mic off for now?
Sorry.
No problem, just because I heard typing.
Yeah.
Thank
you. So this is, in brief, this is why we have to have the scientific method. The scientific method allows us to borrow and integrate other people's perspectives. So we triangulate subjectivity, right? Like one of my favorite words is intersubjective. So broadly speaking, and then I'll wrap up, we have access to subjective experience, which is what we perceive as individuals. We have access to intersubjective experience, which is what we get by conversation. This is what I'm experiencing. What are you experiencing? This is what I'm experiencing. What are you experiencing? And we can put enough of those, like I drop some soap and it falls on the ground. I also drop some soap on this is the scientific method. And social science is tricky because social science is enough of us comparing our perspectives that we get some defensible understanding of human nature. And so, for example, in social science, there's what's called the weird problem, which is that most social science is based on Western psychology students. And so this is a more recent development of social science, is like, oh, let's examine all these different cultures and see if it maps across. So all of that to say that when we approach the question of what we describe as science and religion, we are actually engaging with our own emotional needs. And this is from a very ministerial perspective. So me as academics want to know what's true. And ministers want to know like what's effective and what helps and what's healthy. Like I am literally, my job is to help people cope with being conscious as a minister. And so again, that's the framing I want to offer, is that in this discussion of science and religion, we are engaging with our own emotional relationship with what we think of as science and religion, and especially how we experience what we think of as threatening and what we think of as exciting. And so this is where openness to new experiences. So for example, I don't know how you are, John. Kenneth, you're probably in the middle, where I have a catastrophic enthusiasm to newness. Like that's just in my personality type. So I've never been distressed by my faith transition. Like when I finished my undergraduate degree, I believed every single word of scripture. And then when I first semester of grad school, I'm like, oh, that's all wrong. Cool. And I rewrote it. Like I rewrote Mormonism like pretty much instantly. Like that was my secret, is I rewrote Mormonism through undergrad, and I still believed in the fundamentals of like through my comprehensive exams. And then I got to world religions and I'm like, oh, even that breaks down. Okay. But I just want to be very sensitive to the fact that other people experience, and this comes from like evolutionary psychology, where nature and systems are the ones who are adjusting us. And basically nature will protect conservative approaches to things because it's what's worked. One of my favorite summaries is that liberals have good ideas and conservatives get things done. And so we need to be very, and I think this is the key actually, to compassion across different worldviews, because, and I, like it's poignant that liberal and conservative have become bad words these days, right? But from a social scientific perspective, it really is about adaptability and openness to new experience. Are you going to cling? So from a nature perspective, what nature needs is nature will continue to replicate what's been done until something catastrophic happens, and then it'll try something new. And so the best adaptation is that nature will mostly stick with conservative, but will keep enough crazies in the wings in case things blow up, and then something different will have to come in to rebuild what's new. John, you can correct me with that, but I think that from a strategic, like that's what nature does strategically. So again, just to summarize,
sure.
I hope that as we listen to this conversation, we can check in with ourselves. Mm-hmm. What are our needs? Because again, we have this dual need as human beings for stability and for interest, and we're gonna differ based on that. And so I think there's a term in ministry called growing edge. Think about it like working out. Like if you don't push hard enough, you're not building any muscle. If you push too hard, you're going to injure yourself. And it's very similar to that with like getting new information. It's the things that you can't even comprehend, and then the things that you already know. So hopefully in this conversation, we can keep in that interesting level of being open to new ways of thinking.
Sure. Thank you, Jared. And I just wanted to quickly interject that I think we can, comfort those who lean more conservative and are maybe, afraid to consider, or not afraid, but hesitant to consider other alternatives or what new information, what kind of effect it might have on your worldview or most deeply held beliefs, is that we see a lot of variety in the world. People are very informed, and they fall on various sides and various positions when it comes to religion and science and everything, and what science and religion mean in their lives. And the other thing is that I think that many people in the world, unless they are, let's say, deliberately staying away from fruits of science. They accept science in their lives, readily. Unless you're, let's say, Amish or Mennonite or whatever, then people tend to accept the fruits of science, and I think that and due to that, it will not be threatening for them to discuss, what is the scientific method and the scientific worldview that helped all these fruits to come about. So I think that we can. This is a good segue now to proceed to that. Maybe
one more quick comment.
Sure.
Another ministerial note. I also think it's helpful to be self-reflective around what does our spirituality do for us. So I think it's irresponsible to break down things more than we can rebuild them. And that's why I'm glad that this conversation is focused on being constructive. And we don't often think about what our religion does. It's like, so I think that's useful, where it's like, what do our beliefs do for us? And I think that's a constructive approach, kind of like how to put your car back together again after you deconstruct the engine or whatever.
Sure.
I think and this is more ministerial, where it's like, okay, what are my security needs? Like, what does my worldview do for me? And you kind of protect that. You're like, okay, like I need this. And then how can I incorporate new information and still protect? It's like a relationship. Like if you're in a committed relationship and you're like, I have some difficult things I need to talk about in my relationship, but I want to protect the stability. Or employment, where it's like, I have some feedback from my boss, but I also want to keep my job. How do I talk to my boss and keep my job?
Sure.
I think it's the same way with a worldview. If you say like, okay, what do I need from my worldview? How do I maintain and protect that while also incorporating this new information? So that's getting
I would suggest our audience that one way to treat this discussion today is treat it as a trip to a foreign country, where you go there, you look around, you take in the sights and sounds, and then you go back home, and then you think about it, like, did I learn something? Is there something that was really cool that I want to incorporate? Is there something I want to read more about this? So I think that this would be another productive approach. But so if we were to move on, John, you have worked as a scientist. You have been, you have studied science. You've taught it. So if you were to explain, like, what is science, what is natural science, and what is the scientific method, maybe I'll just give you the floor to discuss these topics.
Sure, thank you. And that was an awesome introduction to especially the human component of belief, Jared. I really appreciated that. And so I think it also, just by way of introduction, having transitioned from a more fundamentalist view into sort of post-Mormon, I've also spent a great deal of time grappling with and reconstructing my personal worldview. And I would say, like, some of the things that I feel convinced of, at least right now, is that, I'm not a nihilist, meaning, like, I haven't abandoned all sort of meaning or sense of meaning in my life. I'm not a reductionist. I don't feel that, we're just atoms. So anytime you use the word just, you're sort of indicating that you've reduced it to these basic components. And I don't view reality in those terms. And I think there's grounds for that scientifically as well, for thinking not reducing everything into these sort of dry, meaningless parts. And so that's the impression I think people can get of science and scientists sometimes. And that's certainly not the way I view myself, and especially not the way I view the world and my relationships, right? And so, but I do, having gone through the scientific, sort of enterprise for many years, and been part of that, I gained a deep appreciation for the work that scientists are trying to do. And I think to keep this sort of at an accessible level, I think the easiest way to think about science is to think of it in terms of trying to create models that describe and predict the behavior of our universe, right? So everything that we see, and also ourselves to some extent. And we can think about that in terms of layers. So at the base layer, we have physics, which is thinking about the smallest pieces and the most fundamental laws, both at the smallest levels and at the broadest levels, so astronomically. And then layered on top of that is chemistry. It's how do these fundamental pieces interact when they begin as molecules, and what are those properties of those molecules, and what are the laws governing the transformations at that level. And then just slightly off of that, you have geology, which is part scientific and part kind of historical analysis of how did the Earth get here, and what were the principles and forces driving it, and what can we say with any confidence about what happened historically. And then on the other side is you have the pursuits of organic chemistry and biochemistry, leading into biology, and then ecologies, and then psychology and sociology. So one way to think about these is the way scientists tend to view these is you have kind of layers of structure or information, and the higher levels build on top of, or the technical term is they supervene on the lower levels. And so like our inside of our bodies, we have an enormous amount of chemical reactions occurring but for instance, our conscious experience, the way I'd say most scientists think about that is our conscious experience is somehow supervening on this, and you might on the chemistry. And then this, in the same way that our sociology, our group structures supervene on our individual predispositions and ways of thinking. And so but what emerges at each of these levels is behavior that would be very difficult to, if not impossible, and to predict from just an understanding of the lower level. In other words, it's very difficult to predict how societies will react, or let's just say like how the economy is going to react, if all you are aware of are physical principles. So we don't yet have any, we're very poorly, we're not able right now to really work up through these layers of understanding. And so we tend to focus on a particular layer where we can find models that describe the things that we are interested in. And then I think the key thing, especially with regards to religion as a contrast, is that science is dedicated, or it tries to be at least, dedicated to the idea that we want predictions that are meaningful, and the meaning is that it needs to actually resolve some uncertainty, and the only way to do that is that it needs to make predictions that can be falsified. And so there's some piece of information that if we saw the world in this way, we would say, hey, our model is wrong, and we can talk about it. The reality is that it doesn't quite work that way. We tend to have a particular model that is useful and functional, and then when it starts to break down in its ability to predict certain edge cases, then we start to rethink that model, and there becomes this point of crisis, and then a paradigm shift, and we find there's some new model that we say, hey, we think this is a better model. It explains all the previous data that we were aware of, these observations, and then now we're going to push that out even further, and we're going to see how well it applies. Is it consistent? Does it cohere? And if it does, and as it does, normal science sort of proceeds until, again, we bump up against these edges, and we have to, we have some paradigm shift. And so that's maybe kind of an introduction, but at its core, I would say, science is about finding models and finding objective ways to compare or to evaluate the accuracy of those models and doing it in a way that is as unbiased as possible. And we've already talked about, like, humans are like incredibly biased, and so science has really progressed insofar as it has created structure to allow us to test things in as unbiased a manner as possible.
Sure.
Really quick comment. I think one of the most common confusions around science and religion and pretty much everything is that we conflate or confuse the method and the outcome. So when people think about science, they think about like the way the world works, and it's not that. Neither is history what happened. Science is like a model, as John said, of approaching and understanding reality. History is a story about what happened in the past. And most people don't like that level of discomfort. They don't like this. I mean, I like the idea, like, everything is mystery, everything is art, play with it. But most people are uncomfortable. Like, they want to understand, like, this is who and how I am, and this is who and how you are, and this is who and like how reality is. But I think that's a super important paradigm. The science is a way of discovering, and that's what we're talking about.
Sure, but so to maybe put it in more, well, not maybe practicable, but something in my own experience is that I was born some 40 odd years ago. I came into this world, and then I started living my life and experiencing things around me, and then I didn't think of it, like, I didn't have like a long view of human history, right? Because it's not natural for you to, let's say, to be born and then you start thinking, well, I wonder how people lived like 100,000 years ago. But what I want to say is that I guess what I'm trying to ask of you to comment is, like, when did people start thinking scientifically, and what kind of effect did it have on humanity?
Jared, you're welcome to field that one if you want. So I'm happy to stumble through, the history of sciences, but yeah, go for it if you have.
Well, we don't have to go through like what exactly happened when, but can you? I guess what I'm trying to say is that it seems to me that there was this long period of human civilizations going through generations that there were no really big transformational changes. Obviously, there's always been progression, and different human activities have always evolved, but it seems to me that there was this transition period in human history when the science and scientific worldview sort of like started or started to mature into its more modern
I can make a quick comment about the beginning, and then John, maybe you can pick it up. It's called the axial age. And it's really interesting because it's around like 600 BCE, 400 BCE, like somewhere in there. It's super fascinating because multiple cultures across the globe all had these similar complementary insights. So, for example, you have the beginning of the Greek philosophers, where there's economic and political and philosophical developments around how do we know what we know, what is the nature of reality. We have Hinduism becomes more philosophical. We have the founding of Buddhism. We have the Israelite prophets, who engage in social commentary. We have this insight. Like, one of the important developments in Israelite culture is that there is some idea of goodness that is bigger than the king. Because like before the axial age, you have this idea that the world is governed by supernatural beings, and that the important way to understand and engage with reality is to placate the supernatural beings. And one thing that we don't often think of that Dan Dennett talks about, for example, is what did religion evolve from? And he has a really great summary that religion is domesticated superstition. And so up into the, I mean, there are some exceptions, like Akhenaten, who is Tutankhamun's father, was like the first monotheist that we know of. Like, it's wild. For some crazy reason, he like denounced the Egyptian pantheon. He started worshiping the sun disk. His art was much more representative. Like, it wasn't that like royal stylized. He has like a little chubby tummy. And then they like chiseled out his name. So there are these exceptional forebears, but for the most part, and then you have Buddhism in India, you have like Taoism and even Confucianism in China. And so it's really interesting that in multiple places in the globe, you have this shift where humans start thinking, what is a way to understand reality beyond what the gods want and how to keep them happy?
Interesting. Okay. So would you say that this was a period of great, let's say, development in abstract thinking and things of that nature, but even that period was not yet the birth of like the truly how should I say scientific worldview, meaning, you know, like based on empiricism and such.
I think that's an overstatement, because like Aristotle was the foundation of most things that end with ism and office. I mean, Aristotle was phenomenal, and we don't give enough credit. And as I said, like even the Buddhist texts, and there are the Upanishads are Hindu texts, and they have fantastically agnostic, open framings of things where they're like, the gods created the universe, or did they? I don't know. You know, so it's we could call it an early preparation and foundation for the philosophy of science, but very specifically, I mean, the Greek philosophers, because we're in Western culture, you know, they get a lot of emphasis, but I think that we can honor them a lot where they genuinely did set the foundation. And Aristotle was, of course, in the 300s BCE. So I would say that like the 600s, 700s, 800s BCE is where, so for example, it's like our oldest, the 800s is where the social prophets of the Israelites, they started critiquing the power systems in a way where they said, like, we can understand and engage reality in a way that is bigger than kings or gods. And I think that is the key shift that like breaks up this gridlock and frees up space to think in a way that, again, critiques the way we understand the world, that then allows for new ways of understanding the world.
But guys, a quick question, or sorry, John, you wanted to say something, please.
Yeah,
go ahead.
well, yeah, so I mean, I think all of these points are accurate as far as I understand them, and great. And that's the you know, speaking of like, say, so a lot of these principles were formalized during what we call, you know, the scientific revolution. And really there were just phases, multiple revolutions in different aspects. But it was, you can definitely, most of these scholars had been going back and had been rereading ancient works, and they had been influenced by the sort of the science and the scholarship of Islamic scholars and Hellenistic scholars. And so it was all of this digging back into the past that definitely did in much part lay a foundation in Europe for the scientific revolution and the eventual formalization of some of these principles. So Francis Bacon and John Locke, this is kind of in the 1600s-ish, you could say they formalized this process, but it was already happening. So Copernicus is sort of that moment where people say, hey, this was the beginning of the scientific revolution, but it was formalized as it went along. It's sort of like a car that's being driven and it's being remodeled as it goes and as it's making these observations. And it's certainly all of those elements in some form or fashion were there in history, and yeah, Jared's right that tons of those were present in Aristotle and what he was thinking about. And so, but yeah, so formally we think about those things coming together in very explicit forms, say with like Francis Bacon and John Locke. So.
Mm-hmm. Jared, would you be willing to talk a little bit about what is modern scholarship of religion and scriptures, and how does it differ maybe from like let's say a general like Sunday school approach to scriptures? What can you explain the difference and how science plays a role in it?
Hi, this is a very debated field. We had in graduate school, we had what is religion and how do you even study it? And a playful way that I begin the conversation is that religion is the only aspect of human culture that has convinced humans that it's not an aspect of human culture. Just think about that. Because religion is an integrated exploration of the transcendent. And it really is, and one thing that I play with in my own life is that literal belief in religion works better than a scientific understanding of religion. It's kind of like if your fridge is together, it keeps your food cold. If it's apart, it's easier to understand, right? But your fridge across the kitchen floor is not keeping your food cold. And it's very difficult to understand religion. Like in graduate school, I sent one of my professors an email that says, when studying religion makes you lose it. Like a playful, just lose your mind. So this is where history of interpretation is so important to understand. And one of the big differences between the scientific revolution and the academic study of religion is that the scientific revolution by its nature has been very self-aware. It's been very transparent. It's been autopsied, so to speak. I mean, we're constantly cutting it open, whereas religion resists that scrutiny. So you have the Scopes trial with Darwin, and this is the story of the relationship between science and religion, and then I'll get to your direct question, is that religion integrates with systems of power. Think about Christendom, and that the Islamic Empire, and even Buddhism, which Buddhism is a bit different because it builds in agnosticism in a really delightful way. But religion has integrated very powerfully with politics. That will not surprise anyone. And so we're looking at the history of interpretation. And so most from the Greek philosophers, a lot of the science that happened was within the Christian empire, within the Muslim empire, and within the different Asian empires and so forth. And so for a long time, science was constrained within what religion would allow. And when science, I joke, I mean, even like Newton was very religious, and a lot of scientists went to seminary. And like it's very much like this archetype where the son challenge, or the child challenges their parent. And it's true that in the Renaissance, like religion birthed science. And then like academia is developed directly out of monastic orders. Hospitals are direct, like most of what we think of as Western civilization is birthed directly out of religious organizations. Like we have to honor that. And one of the really sobering things that is worth respecting is that religious organizations have taken care of people better, more consistently than any alternative. I mean, socialism is go Kenneth, but like socialism is a current experiment, that does quite well. And I think socialism is about as good as it gets. So the way that most people understand religion is where they fall in the history of interpretation with religion. So for example, let's talk about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints just for a few minutes, because it's the framework of a lot of our understanding. So the LDS Church is what's called Restorationist Protestantism. So super quickly, what happened was you have Oriental Christianity that we don't even think about, like Coptic Christianity, Armenian Christianity, Syriac Christianity. But the framework of what most of our listeners will be aware of, I mean, yours will be more aware of, like Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Christianity. But in the United States, for example, most people are aware of like Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. Like that's what we think of when we think of Christianity. And again, like in Europe, we're more aware of like Eastern Orthodox, and that broke apart for its own reasons. So basically, in the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants said what the Catholic Church is does not line up with what's in the Bible. Let's follow what's in the Bible. So sola scriptura, like scripture alone was the call there. And then Restorationist Protestantism goes even further, and this is where Mormonism comes from. The LDS Church it's this idea that not only it kind of mixes Catholicism and Protestantism in an interesting way, where it says Catholicism is right in that there really was this, like Jesus established a church with authority. So not only is the Bible correct, but the Bible has this way of that you should build a church. And Protestantism is right in that the Catholic Church is wrong. But so this is like Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostalism has some interesting origins here, and the LDS Church. So Restorationist Protestantism says everything is wrong. We need to go back to the original pure truth and restore that. So that's the heritage of the LDS Church. So the academic study of religion studies how it came to be that people believe what they did. And religious studies is infamously interdisciplinary. I mean, it really does intersect with almost every area of human exploration, which I think is really, really cool, because that speaks to the power of it. So very briefly, in order to study religion, you need to study the scriptural texts. You need archaeology to understand the past. You need to understand, study the languages that the ancient texts were written in. And it really was the Germans and the British who established this more than anything. So it's like, how do we understand the past? How do we understand texts? How do we understand cultures, basically? So that would get into the anthropology of religion, the psychology of religion, and the sociology of religion. But what I want to speak about just for a few minutes, and maybe we can go further from that point, is how do we understand our sacred texts? And Henry Eyring Sr., so President Eyring's dad, was a famous chemist, and he wrote this wonderful book called Reflections of a Scientist. And he has this wonderful summary where he says, God's word in the Bible is contradicted by God's word in the rocks. And I think one of the most useful understandings that we can have, and I think you'll love this, John, is that the natural world is its own sacred text. Isn't that lovely? And so we are our own sacred text. And so I love bringing this all together by saying, like, it's all sacred text. So instead of saying, like, well, I'm disturbed because the Bible is not what I thought it was, we can have a conversation where it's like, what is the sacred text of my experience? What is the sacred text of geology? What is the sacred text of chemistry? And I think that's a really, really useful way of thinking about it. And so one issue is that the Bible itself, like most of those are Bibles back there, like the Bible itself is not coherent. The Bible was written roughly over 1,000 years that it was transmitted, composed, formed, edited, and so forth. So from like our earliest level,
sort of like the Book of Mormon. I was just kidding, of course.
Right, but interestingly, like the way the Book of Mormon presents itself is surprisingly self-aware. I mean, like the Book of Mormon is fascinating in its current form, where it's like, and then we edited this, and then we had this, then we abridged this, and now I'm talking, and now I'm talking, and now I'm talking. And that's if only the Bible were that aware. So and I'll bring this all together in just a moment. Most of the Jewish scriptures as we have them was put together in like the 500s and 400s, so after the Babylonian exile. And so that was taking like older texts and traditions. I personally think that the first traditions were written down in the time of Solomon, because that is where there would be enough infrastructure to like actually write things down. And then he also had the Egyptian influence. So the Bible was a little backwater culture nestled between superpowers. So the superpowers of the biblical tradition were Egypt on the west and Mesopotamia on the east, which were the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And then we had the Persians, and they were the regional superpowers. So we take the Bible seriously enough that we think the Bible's a big deal. But I think it's very beautiful and powerful that the Bible was actually composed by oppressed peoples. All of them were. And that makes it very, very compelling. And so
quickly, I'll just quickly interject that also I think a lot of people, including myself, I mean, I didn't realize how much, let's say, the surrounding cultures and people influence the Bible. For example, Zoroastrianism, the different concepts that
Zoroastrianism is a really fun one, because our concepts of heaven, hell, paradise, judgment are all Zoroastrian. Like it's wild. And you are absolutely correct that, because this is what you're talking about, Kenneth, is called a canonical approach to biblical interpretation, which makes total sense, because if I weren't wearing pajama pants, I'd go grab one. But it's like the Bible as we have it. Like one thing that I did in a presentation is I took one page out of the Gospel of Matthew and said, like, this was printed in 2000 something from a translation from the 1970s, from a text, from the 100s, and it goes back. And so there's the Old Testament and New Testament, and the New Testament was composed. Obviously, Jesus died in about 27 CE, and the last book of the Bible was written in about 130. The first book of the New Testament was written in about 49. The first gospel was written in about 69. The first complete Bible was written in the 300s, but it had different books than what we have. There was debate about what belongs in the Bible up until like 1,000. And then you have the battles of interpretation. And so the insight I had when I began a graduate program, a PhD program in biblical studies, was, whoa, academia can understand religion a lot better than my LDS upbringing explained religion in the Bible. And I would gently say this is an area where Latter-day Saint culture is profoundly irresponsible, because the basic narrative is they're wrong, don't pay attention to them, we have the Spirit and the priesthood. Am I wrong? That's the basic framing. And I grieve, and I say this very constructively and compassionately, because the LDS Church could do so much better. There are amazing, amazing resources, and we could learn so much. We have Islamic traditions, Catholic traditions, Protestant traditions. Like, we have so many examples. The Jesuits, holy crap, right, John? I mean, like, Jesuits are unbelievable in their devotion to academics. And one of the things that I most want for the culture of my heritage, for Latter-day Saints, is that we embrace a level like this integration of science and religion, because with the belief in continuing revelation, we could do it better than anyone ever has. So just bringing it all together, the reason why there's that difference, again, is because we have inherited a particular point in the history of interpretation. And one interesting thing about Latter-day Saint culture, we were playfully talking about it before we started recording, is Joseph Smith's, the scripture that was revealed through Joseph Smith incorporates the scientific understanding of his time. That makes total sense, you know, from a theological point of view. So that, like, the first things that I wrote in graduate school were revelation according to our language and revelation according to our expectations. And that's what's called epistemology, which is like the philosophy of how do we know what we know, and what is the relationship between what we know and what is real. And so again, the academic understanding of religion is as scientific as we can get. You know, like, what can we know using archaeology to understand the past? And again, textual interpretation is my specialty, which is, as we read the Bible or any other religious text as carefully as we can in the original languages, understanding the current culture, the surrounding culture, and there are so many levels of this. You know, what does this particular passage mean? How is it composed? How is it formed? How is it understood? What was the culture of the time? And so, to conclude this moment, the way people understand it is from Isaiah, my ways are not your ways, right? Like, God's ways are higher than human ways. But what struck me in grad school was, the godly ways look suspiciously the way humans understood reality at the time that these texts were written that are talking about God. Curious.
Yeah. John, do you have do you want to comment on what Jared said, or?
No, yeah, I love his framing around all of these things. So these are just brilliant insights, I think, to these tensions and ways of resolving them and thinking about the world. I think in terms of setting up discussion of science and religion, it is like one of the things that we had discussed previously, Kenneth, was the Copernican revolution, basically the heliocentric and geocentric models of the solar system. And I think it might be useful to, so right now, well, certain religious traditions have done better at integrating science into their tradition, and at various stages, we were talking about this earlier. So especially early on, the Latter-day Saint tradition was very interested in integrating science, the best science of the day into the way they thought about things. And you see that in like the Book of Mormon, where, Jared was pointing that out, is, surely it is the sun that revolves around the earth, as an example of
or
where
the opposite. Surely it is the earth that moves, not the sun. You said the opposite.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Well, sure, yeah. Oh, yeah. Surely it is the earth. Yes. So sorry, I've been down the Copernican rabbit hole, and my frames of references are all over the place. But exactly. So they were trying to represent the understanding of the world at that time accurately. In the Latter-day Saint tradition, I think did that in many ways fairly well. But yeah. So I have two quotes here that I think represent the tension between these enterprises. And Jared has already kind of laid this out, that on some sense, it's the observation that are recorded in Scripture versus the observations, of the kind of the natural world. And so here's Martin Luther in 1539 speaking. He's writing about Copernicus. And this is what he says: "There's talk of a new astrologer who wants to prove that the earth moves and goes around instead of the sky, the sun, the moon, just as if somebody were moving in a carriage or ship might hold that he was sitting still and at rest while the earth and the trees walked and moved. But that is how things are nowadays. When a man wishes to be clever, he must invent something special, and the way he does it must needs be the best. The fool wants to turn the whole art of astronomy upside down. However, as Holy Scripture tells us, so did Joshua bid the sun to stand still and not the earth." So as this final sort of appeal to Scripture, and also the current, kind of the current scientific dogma, because at that time, so when Copernicus was, presenting his heliocentric model, that the sun was at the center of the solar system, and the earth was, and the planets were revolving around it. So I'm losing track because I'm trying to integrate these things. But
but John, can
yes.
I just say that the reason that Copernicus disputed the Earth-centric model was not because he had some revelation about the scriptures, and how they should be interpreted. What was the reason that he disputed it, and why did he, come out with this new heliocentric model?
Yeah, well, I think he was looking for, it was well known that there were tensions in the geocentric model and especially the biggest issue is that it was really difficult to explain what they called retrograde motion. So under that model, as the planets would appear, if you watch them over time, they will go in one direction and then they'll reverse course and in this retrograde motion, and then they'll reverse course again. And so this was just, like, why does this even happen? And so and that's at the fundamental level was the drive, I think, to understand this. And so by switching frames of reference, and again, other people had done this before, but he did this mathematically, then he was able to make pretty good predictions. But it wasn't, there were scientific reasons for the geocentric model. There was resistance. For instance, there was the idea that, hey, if the earth is actually rotating, wouldn't that create massive wind? And so there was like, no, this can't this is insane. Like, why are we doing this? And it also was this, from our frame of reference, it does appear that the earth stands still. And so there are observations that fit very nicely with a geocentric model. And so I don't want to say that and that's how most of these things are, is like there were good reasons to accept that. And so what eventually happened, though, is that it was an accumulation of observations that just could not be explained in that previous model, and they were very compelling. And so, and this is basically Galileo with newer telescopes, newer technology. He was able to observe moons around Jupiter. And this was kind of a violation of the geocentric model where everything was meant to be rotating around the Earth. And then here we have these objects that are definitely appear to be rotating around Jupiter. And then he was also able to observe phases of Venus. So just the way the moon has phases, as it basically based on the reflection of the sun, and the way those phases were violated the sort of basic, orientation and geometry of the universe if it were geocentric. And so it was this accumulation of observation. But Galileo encountered a lot of resistance, and this is, I think, the frustration of science. And so science and religion have kind of been at loggerheads. They've been, smashing against one another. But you can hear, so this is Galileo in 1610. He's writing a letter to Kepler, and Kepler was the one who proposed the elliptical orbits that was a much more accurate representation of the solar system than what Copernicus had done. But listen to what Galileo says. He says, my dear Kepler, I wish that we might laugh at the remarkable stupidity of the common herd. What do you have to say about the principal philosophers of this academy who are filled with the stubbornness of an asp, and do not want to look at either the planets, the moon, or the telescope, even though I have freely and deliberately offered them the opportunity 1,000 times? Truly, just as the asp stops its ears, so do these philosophers shut their eyes to the light of truth. And so you can see just between, both, the religionists and the scientists were very, I think, frustrated with the other positions. And so that, Galileo, a lot of people say, well, the church was, antagonistic to these things. Originally, the church was actually pretty, the Catholic Church in particular, they were receptive to the Copernican model on some level. And it is much more complex than we often paint it. But Galileo, he essentially used the Pope as his foil in discussions in some of his writings, and made the Pope look really, really dumb in these discussions. So my point is that, and science has kind of been doing this for the past few, centuries. It was poking the bear, so to speak, and and in some sense frustrated by the lack of willingness to just like that, look through the telescope, look at the primary data, and and appreciate how a different model explains the data so much, potentially so much better.
Really quick, I love that comment. And John, your comments illuminate that we're not so much talking about religion and science as tradition and innovation. Because it's, as you said, it's not just the religious and the scientific, but it's also the scientific and the scientific. Like there's always that where like someone proposes a new model and all of those who of the academy, of the traditional, they're like, no, it can't be like this. And again, that's for human reasons where we want to justify our investments. We want the way we live to be worthwhile. And so it's incredibly painful. Like if I've built my entire career on one way of looking at something, to have someone be like, nope, that's wrong. And it takes a particular kind of training of mind and soul to like, oh, wow, please prove me wrong. Like, potentially devalue everything I've ever done. And so I think one way that we're advancing as scientists is to, and it takes a particular kind of maturity and humility combined, which is rare, to say like, please prove me wrong. Like I will be excited if like everything I've done enables you to break it.
Sure.
So tradition versus innovation, I think, is a great way to think about this.
Yes, I agree. But on the other hand, I would also say that religions, for the most part, all the big religions, their roots are coming from texts that were written thousands of years ago, and on top of it, there is belief that they were given from God, which is a higher mind, a omniscient mind, and therefore there's real tension there. So maybe because we have about 10 minutes, I would like maybe start with Jared and John then afterwards. Would you both comment on, like, what do you see are the reasons that religions sort of they tend to not embrace many scientific advances or new understanding about topics that have been received through scientific study? I mean, even for our own church, we could say, or for the LDS church, we could say that the church is not overly enthusiastic in, let's say, embracing studies of LGBT, questions. So, like, what is the big obstacle there? Why doesn't the church override its dogmas based on new scientific research and understanding?
Go ahead, please.
No, I just wanted to jump in and say that they are happy to embrace the science that confirms their position. Maybe you're about to make the same point. They love
I think even disconfirms. So, for example, electricity, like all the conveniences of, like the difference between, to use a provocative example, of like Al-Qaeda versus the Taliban, is Al-Qaeda was actually embracing all sorts of technology. It was very innovative. It was trying to move forward. Where the Taliban is genuinely like, no, we really want to go back to the way it was during Grandpa's time. And so you said this in the beginning, Kenneth, is that all institutions are happy to adopt the fruits of science that are beneficial or neutral to them. And so the LDS Church is, its business acumen is some of the best in the world. I mean, it's very, very impressive with the way that it integrates economic insights. And the LDS Church is also cutting edge, I would say, with communication technology. The LDS Church is very, very good at embracing communication technology. But one tricky thing, and this is where social science comes back in, is that I would argue that religion is, so to bracket it, I think that the way religion functions is observable and allows for multiple theological explanations. And so this is the way that I said it to Bart Ehrman in 2006. I said, one of two things is true, and I was a believing member of the church at the time. I said, one of two things is true. Either God exists and communicates to us through our brains, bodies, groups, physiology, sociology, psychology, or our physiology, sociology, psychology is constructed in such a way that we believe in God. So we can look at what's called phenomenology, which is like the actual lived religious experience. So religious visions are a scientific reality. Like, it is a psychological reality that people have religious visions. What is the relationship between those visions and wider reality? That's a question of theology and philosophy. So I'm going to talk about, like, my answer will be like the social science of religion. And I would argue that religion has been more successful than any other aspect of culture in structuring our lives, providing stability, nurturing constructive relationships, giving meaning, and encouraging social cooperation than any other social institution ever. And one thing that's wild, Yuval Harari makes a very provocative argument in *Sapiens* that I agree with. He basically says all social institutions are religions. And I agree with that. But what we think of as religion, the very fact that we think of it as coming from, so functionally, God is the personification of social ideals. Isn't that elegant? Like, God functioned as the internalization, the internalized personification of social ideals. And for the most part, God is, like, impressive. in that it really is, it's not just social norms, it genuinely is social ideals. Like that's amazing. And so the super succinct thing is that I think people and groups and institutions are reluctant, resistant, and hesitant to embrace the disruptive aspects of science because there is a tension between like technological innovation and social wellness. And this would be a good thing for us to pick up next time, because and let me conclude by saying we are in an absolute mental health crisis. And I think that we are in a crisis mostly like we are miserable, and we are we are in extraordinary misalignment with well-being. And now I think the biggest reason for that is that our current technology is a slave to exploitative consumerist capitalism. Like I think in the 1400s we made the decision that the illusion of economic growth at any cost is the new God. And that is the actual current religion. The actual current religion of the world is exploitative, world-destroying illusion of economic growth in this consumerist way. And interestingly, religion is actually protecting people from that. Like it plays in a very, very interesting way where this illusion that we only exist to make and spend money, religion actually says, no, we're more important than that. You are cosmically important. It's about love. It's about relationship. And I know I picked up a lot of really, really big topics, but I think we need to look at that. And so my hope, and I'll end on a positive note, is that we can integrate new science in a way that preserves and perhaps even prioritizes human wellness. And I think that's the actual target.
Okay.
And so I think those are just awesome, fascinating, wonderful ideas. I mean, I think most of the time I just nod my head in agreement to everything that Jared says. I think his ideas are fantastic. And I think the potential pushback comes in sort of two areas. Is one is that that maybe religion is enabling the status quo. So things of like right now, so this, we have the consumerism or the capitalism that may be very destructive currently, and especially ecologically. So most scientists will concede that we're in the 6th great extinction event right now. We have massive problems with climate change and plasticizers and toxins, and like we have major structural issues. And religion sometimes, because of its it integrates itself into the power structures, and so it sometimes can support and allow us to sort of just continue on in the ways of being. And so I think there's and that is a potential issue with some of the religious structures.
No disagreement there. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then I think then the next big question is, historically, is religion, so we talk about how it has been this great force, sort of a stabilizing force, a nurturing force in many ways of society. It's also, but the question is that necessary, or was that a historical artifact? And so the idea being is that with our current understanding, can we engineer something better, or can we tease out the parts of religion that are working the best and maybe drop some of the more offensive or less progressive aspects of it? And so I'm not articulating this as well as I'd like, but just basically the idea is that in whole or in part, can we do better than religion, knowing what we know now, especially, in the last 40, 50, 60 years, we've gained, tremendous insights into social structures and psychology. And so, have we hit a point where we can re-engineer or and that's, I would say, an open question. I don't think Jared disagrees. I mean, he has lots of ideas about, how do you make religion better? And I think it's an open question. Is like, well, how much do you need to throw away? What's that proportion? What's that ratio? And is it going to be a wholesale reimagining, or is this something where you just need to take what's there and reformulate it, or nudge it along in better directions? And so, I think that's a fascinating thing to consider.
And by the way, this is something that we could discuss in a whole separate, episode if you guys would like. So, but yeah, I actually agree with John with what you said, and I think my closing remark would be that I would, because we all have a LDS Latter-day Saint background, is I would certainly encourage the LDS Church to prioritize environment and climate change in their general conference topics and all other kinds of materials that they put out. And the other thing is that I would also certainly encourage is to be more open to areas where the scientific progress or scientific information or knowledge also basically affects the well-established dogmas, and maybe have some more let's say flexibility with letting people, how should I say, letting people believe and act in more various ways that are in harmony with science. For example, I know that this is a whole different topic, but like if we were to discover, or if people were to discover, or scientists were to discover that in fact coffee does not have only adverse effects on health and behavior, but also positive effects on behavior and such, then why not be more flexible towards people who like to drink their coffee or whatever, or maybe let's be even more dogmatic. If a person who is familiar with religious scholarship does not feel comfortable let's say proclaiming their unwavering knowledge that Jesus Christ, the historical Jesus Christ, was physically resurrected, maybe we don't have to necessarily make it a condition for good standing in the church, or whatever privileges it would bestow. So I would say that this more openness. Go ahead.
Can I make a really quick comment? I love everything you just said. Social norms and institutions function as effective shortcuts to powerful outcomes. So, for example, one of the biggest things that religion does is it manufactures trust, for better and worse. It creates what's called fictive kin groups. So we feel like a family. There's also something called affinity fraud, which is like the dark side of it. But basically, this is the most powerful thing that religion does, is it creates an efficient mechanism of trust. And so that enables us to cooperate really, really quickly together. And my hope for religion is that we do the hard work. We do the hard work where we cultivate. So the current LDS church and religion in general is like, if you are one of us, and this is called high cost signaling. We can dig into it. It's this idea that, like, if you act like me, if you dress like me, if you, it's a little bit, I'll say it respectfully, Like when a LDS member sees another LDS member wear garments, which it's interesting that we check out each other's underwear. There are good reasons for this. Like we feel an instant connection of like, oh, I can trust you. You're in the same group. You're doing the same unusual things that I am, and therefore we can work together. We can trust each other, and that's really compelling. And it's incredibly efficient from a social institutional perspective. And so I think the invitation is, how can we soften up these easy, quick, fast solutions to cultural cohesion, and say and Kenneth, you're doing a great job with this podcast. How do we cultivate a deeper trust based on relationship, even within and across those differences of belief and practice?
Thank you very much. All right, I think we had a very good discussion, and I do hope that that those who listen will find at least different perspectives and maybe new approaches, and be more open to look at their beliefs and their religion from different perspectives, and tolerate those who have different perspectives on religion.
Yeah, I was smiling, John, because you know that what you just described is literally my ministry target, right? Like that's literally the purpose of my nonprofit.
That's right. I'll throw a few softballs out there too, but yes, and it's something that I think it's fair to say that. So even though I kind of am representing the scientific perspective, that we and you more so a little bit more the religious or social science perspective, we actually agree way more than we disagree on any of these aspects. And so I think we all acknowledge the power of religion and its abilities. And so, yeah, there's just a lot. I think we have, more agreement than anything on these topics.
And I thought that was a good podcast, though. So what would you like to